This week, as the largest sporting spectacle in human history kicked off across North America, a quiet bureaucratic maneuver executed thousands of miles away from the pitch fundamentally altered the geopolitical leverage of the host nations. The 2026 World Cup was engineered to be a corporate masterstroke of trilateral unity: 48 nations, 104 matches, and 16 host cities bound together under a single, seamless commercial banner. Yet, right now, as matches get underway, fans from 4 qualified nations are systematically barred from setting foot in the United States to watch their own national teams compete. While players and coaching staff received elite diplomatic exemptions, the ordinary citizens of Iran, Haiti, Senegal, and Ivory Coast have been locked out of the American portion of the tournament entirely. This is not merely an administrative oversight or a localized visa backlog. This is the calculated application of a hardline sovereign border strategy that splits the tournament down its geopolitical fault lines. On one side of the border, the United States is weaponizing its immigration apparatus to project domestic nationalist priorities to a global audience. On the other side, Canada is using the exact same tournament to position itself as the open, stable alternative for international capital, talent, and tourism, for those tracking the shifting tides of North American sovereignty. The stark divergence between these two co-hosts reveals a much deeper structural reality than a multi-city football tournament. To truly understand how this tournament became a geopolitical chessboard, we have to look at the exact chronology of the decrees, because the sequencing demonstrates a deliberate alignment of domestic political timelines over international sporting agreements. The architecture of the current blockade was laid down on June 4, 2025, when the Trump administration signed the first of 2 sweeping presidential proclamations. That initial decree instituted an absolute entry ban on nationals from 12 specific countries, including Iran and Haiti, alongside Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. The official policy narrative framed the restrictions around national security and what the administration characterized as severe screening and vetting deficiencies within those regimes. 7 additional nations faced partial restrictions. That was the opening salvo. But the true inflection point occurred on December 16, 2025, less than 2 weeks after the formal World Cup group draw ceremony in Washington. The administration expanded the travel ban to encompass 39 nations, specifically capturing Senegal and Ivory Coast under partial restrictions tied to historical visa overstay rates. Consider the timing. Both African nations had just successfully qualified for the tournament. Thousands of their citizens had already purchased match tickets, arranged flights, and committed capital to American hospitality vendors. The expanded restrictions took effect on January 1, 2026, precisely 5.5 months before the opening whistle. This specific timeline meant that any national from those 39 restricted states who did not already hold a valid US tourist visa prior to the cutoff date was instantly frozen out of the system. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these structural pivots directly affect our economic sovereignty. Because what we are witnessing is the total subordination of international sporting bodies to the raw exercise of state-art power. The human and symbolic cost of this policy falls squarely on communities that viewed qualification as a historic milestone. For Haiti, the 2026 tournament marked their first successful World Cup qualification since 1974. This squad achieved the near impossible. They qualified without a functioning home stadium, training in exile due to the profound security crises gripping their homeland. When their acting consul general in Boston celebrated the achievement as a symbol of undeniable hope and resilience, he was describing a sporting triumph over sheer adversity. Yet, the strategic reality is that when Haiti played Scotland in their tournament opener on June 13th, the match took place inside an American stadium completely devoid of travelling Haitian supporters. The geopolitical apparatus of the host nation overrode the cultural milestone, leaving the team to compete in a stadium that barred their compatriots at the border. The operational reality for Iran is even more structurally volatile, turning a sports tournament into an active theatre of diplomatic friction. All three of Iran's group stage matches are located on US soil, specifically in Los Angeles and Seattle. While the administration initially offered rhetorical assurances that the team would be permitted to play, the political rhetoric quickly shifted when the executive branch signaled on social media that an Iranian presence on American soil was fundamentally inappropriate. The Iranian Football Federation immediately petitioned FIFA to relocate their matches to Mexico, arguing that the World Cup belongs to an international collective rather than an individual sovereign state. FIFA denied the request, anchoring the matches in American stadiums. The practical consequence of that decision is an unprecedented operational compromise. At least 15 high-ranking Iranian team officials, technical analysts, and support staff were flatly denied US entry visas. As a direct result, the entire Iranian national squad was forced to establish its base of operations in Tijuana, Mexico. The team is currently forced to commute across an international border just to play their matches, retreating back into Mexican territory immediately after the final whistle. Following their opening draw against New Zealand at SoFi Stadium, the Iranian manager openly labelled his squad the most oppressed team in the tournament, confirming they were legally required to evacuate Los Angeles the moment the match concluded. Meanwhile, media outlets like NPR reported that Tijuana has actively embraced the squad, capitalizing on the reputational vacuum left by an American host nation that prefers containment over diplomacy. This friction is driving a broader pushback from international fan bases who are questioning the structural integrity of the joint hosting model. Senegalese supporters, who have historically travelled in thousands to tournaments ranging from Russia to Qatar, find themselves entirely excluded from the American market. Prominent fan leaders have publicly stated to international news agencies that if a country maintains a baseline policy of barring international visitors, it should be legally disqualified from hosting a global event of this magnitude. This is precisely where the strategic gap between the two North American neighbours widens into a chasm. Canada is hosting 13 matches divided between Toronto and Vancouver, and Ottawa has explicitly rejected the implementation of any parallel travel restrictions. There is no matching ban, no blanket containment strategy, and no ideological replication of the American proclamations. Nationals from Iran, Haiti, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and the remaining 35 countries blacklisted by Washington face no extraordinary barriers beyond the standard Canadian visa processing network. Ivory Coast is scheduled for a critical group stage match in Toronto. For Ivorian fans, Canadian soil represents the exclusive geographic window through which they can physically support their national team. Furthermore, for travellers from major emerging economies like Brazil, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan, where obtaining an American visa has become prohibitively expensive, logistically hostile, or statistically unlikely, the Canadian host cities represent the only viable entry points into the entire 2026 tournament. The Canadian state did not stumble into this position. It was a deliberate, calculated policy choice. In December 2025, precisely as Washington was expanding its blacklist, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada published a formal, strategic directive declaring that Canada would proudly welcome athletes, officials, and fans from every corner of the globe without exception. The messaging was an open economic invitation. Prime Minister Mark Carney reinforced this strategic posture at the Washington draw, explicitly committing Canada to an unrestricted open-door policy. When FIFA leadership brought the World Cup trophy to Ottawa last month, the political theatre was deliberate. Carney lifted the trophy, declaring the nation logistically and structurally prepared to absorb the global audience. The economic drivers behind this policy are substantial. The official federal projections indicate that hosting these 13 matches will generate approximately 25,000 jobs within the domestic service, tourism, and logistics sectors, while infusing roughly $2 billion Canadian dollars directly into the national economy. The political executive is leveraging this as a defining national moment. Just yesterday in Vancouver, Carney was observed hosting FIFA officials in a private suite, celebrating Canada's commanding 6-0 victory over Qatar, before entering the locker room to align the state directly with the team's success. The official Canadian digital portal for the World Cup functions as a highly streamlined logistics tool detailing exactly how international travellers can secure documentation, enter the country efficiently, and deploy their capital within local economies. It is a masterclass in economic statecraft disguised as sports marketing. The contrast with the American approach is stark, shifting from a welcoming commercial posture to an overt display of Homeland Security enforcement. In May, the US Department of Homeland Security confirmed that immigration and customs enforcement agents would be actively deployed inside and around World Cup venues. While some administrative sectors attempted to soothe local organising committees by claiming immigration enforcement would not target ticket holders, the official line from the executive branch clarified that ICE maintains its full enforcement mandate at all times, refusing to rule out targeted operations or collateral arrests during the tournament. This aggressive posture triggered a massive institutional backlash. In April 2026, a coalition of over 120 international civil and human rights organisations, anchored by the ACLU and Amnesty International, took the unprecedented step of issuing a formal travel advisory for the United States. The document explicitly warned international journalists, players, and fans about severe risks within the American jurisdiction, including arbitrary denials of entry, mandatory 5-year social media screening histories, and the very real threat of detention for non-citizens. The labour force inside the stadiums responded in kind. Stadium workers at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, organised under Unite Here Local 11, successfully used a strike vote to extract legal clauses allowing them to walk off the job if they determine that active ICE operations jeopardise the physical safety of the staff. When you zoom out from the immediate politics and analyse the macroeconomic indicators, the data demonstrates that this hardline approach is extracting a catastrophic toll on the American tourism export sector. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, the United States was the singular major global destination out of 184 monitored countries to register an absolute decline in international visitor spending throughout 2025. The domestic market lost 4 million international arrivals compared to the previous year, causing an immediate $8.4 billion drop in foreign spending. Crucially for our channel's focus, Canadian cross-border travel to the United States plummeted by a staggering 30%. Independent economic research groups like Tourism Economics were forced to completely abandon their initial projections of a 9% growth curve, revising their forecasts sharply downward to account for the highly polarizing rhetoric and hostile visa protocols emanating from Washington. By April 2026, the structural decay accelerated, with international arrivals dropping another 14% year-over-year, alongside a parallel 14% collapse in summer airline bookings originating from Europe. The cumulative financial penalty imposed on the US tourism economy by these combined executive actions is estimated by industry councils to hover around $15.7 billion, and this is the volatile backdrop against which the United States is attempting to host 78 of the 104 World Cup matches, 3/4 of the entire global tournament. The executive branch repeatedly promised a seamless, world-class experience that would showcase American exceptionalism to the earth. Instead, the administration implemented an aggressive $250 visa integrity fee, mandated the total surrender of half a decade of digital communication data during interviews, and introduced a tier of friction that international analysts describe as fundamentally discriminatory against Muslim-majority and African states. Even the much-touted FIFA Pass system, rolled out in November 2025 to fast-track visa interviews for ticket holders, functions as an empty logistical pipeline. It can accelerate your appointment, but it contains zero legal authority to bypass an executive travel ban. If the border door is locked by presidential decree, a faster interview line simply delivers a faster rejection. When Washington loudly proclaimed in May that it was waiving the $250 visa bond for 50 nations, including Senegal and Ivory Coast, it was executing a hollow public relations gesture, waiving a financial deposit on a visa that the target audience is legally prohibited from obtaining in the first place, while one co-host deploys federal agents to monitor the gates of its stadiums. The other is aggressively capturing the displaced global capital and reputational high ground. The mathematical equation for Canadian strategy is entirely straightforward. Every single international fan, high net worth traveller, and corporate sponsor who is rejected, deterred, or alienated by the American visa apparatus represents a direct economic acquisition for the markets of Toronto and Vancouver. This is the true mechanics of trade diversification in the modern era, capitalising on the strategic self-sabotage of our largest trading partner to anchor Canada as the indispensable, globally connected hub of North American commerce. The tournament is locked into a fixed timeline running until July 19th, while the American travel bans remain open-ended instruments of state power. But as the matches intensify, the most consequential question regarding the future of North American integration remains completely unanswered. But the most consequential question regarding the future of North American integration remains completely unanswered. To understand how a tournament designed as a symbol of continental integration transformed into a mechanism of economic and diplomatic divergence, we must look past the stadium turnstiles and dissect the legal and financial architecture undergirding the host agreements. What was signed behind closed doors between FIFA, the United States government, and the Canadian Federal Executive is not a standard entertainment contract. It is a highly complex, multi-layered regulatory apparatus where sovereign laws, financial exemptions, and corporate mandates collide. By tracking the technical mechanisms of these agreements, we can see exactly how Ottawa and Washington engineered two diametrically opposed strategies to exploit the exact same event. The hidden blueprint of this tournament rests on three distinct pillars of deal architecture: tax expenditures, visa exemptions, and municipal liability shifting. When a country agrees to host a FIFA World Cup, it must sign a binding government guarantee agreement. This document effectively compels the sovereign host state to suspend aspects of its domestic legislative authority to accommodate the commercial priorities of a private, Swiss-based sporting cartel. First, consider the structural mechanics of the tax and corporate law exemptions. Under the terms of the United States Host Agreement, the Internal Revenue Service granted a comprehensive, zero-rated tax exemption to FIFA and its subsidiary entities, covering all corporate income tax, withholding taxes, and sales levies generated throughout the duration of the tournament. However, Washington explicitly restricted this tax-free status to FIFA's corporate core and its Tier 1 global partners, such as Coca-Cola and Visa. Crucially, the American deal architecture refused to extend automatic tax relief or fast-tracked business licensing to secondary, non-aligned foreign commercial entities or independent international vendors trying to enter the market for the tournament. Canada, conversely, executed a completely different fiscal strategy through the Department of Finance and the Canada Revenue Agency. The Canadian government implemented a broad-spectrum customs and excise tax waiver that went significantly further than the American template. Under this domestic framework, any international enterprise, vendor or cultural exhibition group registered with a participating nation can import commercial equipment, promotional materiel, and corporate assets into Canadian territory duty-free. This technical tax architecture was specifically designed to capture secondary economic activity. By lowering the fiscal barrier to entry, Ottawa ensured that international trade delegations from nations currently alienated by the American banking and visa system could set up parallel trade summits in Vancouver and Toronto. Second, the border and security mechanisms reveal an even sharper systemic divide. The core of the conflict traces back to a legal instrument known as Government Guarantee No. 3, the Visa and Entry Exemption Clause. Under standard FIFA hosting rules, the host nation is required to guarantee visa-free entry, or at least automated non-discriminatory visa issuance to all ticket holders, media personnel, and official delegations. When the United States signed these guarantees during the initial bidding cycle, the State Department agreed to establish an expedited processing track. However, the technical execution of the Trump administration's 2025 presidential proclamations legally superseded those initial guarantees. The American legal framework is structured so that executive immigration powers under Section 212 of the Immigration and Nationality Act maintain absolute supremacy over any international sporting agreement. When Secretary Mark Wayne Mullins deployed immigration and customs enforcement personnel to World Cup venues, he was enforcing a domestic statutory mandate that flatly invalidated the spirit of FIFA's border guarantees, Canada's legal architecture. Coordinated through Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, avoided this institutional collision by embedding the World Cup logistics directly into its broader economic immigration strategy, instead of relying on ad hoc executive waivers that could be challenged or revoked. Ottawa utilised a dedicated regulatory pathway under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. This specific framework allows the Canadian executive to classify all verified World Cup ticket holders, international cultural delegates, and support staff under a specialised public interest administrative class. This administrative designation bypasses the standard biometrics bottlenecks and local consular interview queues that have paralysed US visa offices overseas. By codifying this open-door mechanism into formal regulatory law rather than relying on arbitrary political pronouncements, Canada provided international transport networks and corporate sponsors with absolute legal certainty. Third, the division of municipal liability and security funding exposes the true financial risk asymmetric layout of the co-hosting model. In the United States, the federal government designated the World Cup as a national special security event, bringing the Secret Service and federal agencies into the command structure. Yet, the financial terms of the American deal explicitly shift the overwhelming majority of localized policing, infrastructure reinforcement, and emergency management costs onto the municipal host committees and state taxpayers. Cities like Miami, Dallas, and Los Angeles are absorbing hundreds of millions of dollars in structural debt to meet FIFA's rigid security mandates, while federal ICE agents enforce immigration protocols that actively suppress local tourism revenue. The Canadian model inverted this financial risk profile through an unprecedented $750 million Canadian dollar federal sports and infrastructure investum (ENT), announced jointly by Prime Minister Mark Carney and FIFA President Gianni Infantino in Ottawa. This capital deployment represents the largest single sports-related state investment in Canadian history. Rather than forcing Toronto and Vancouver to exhaust their local municipal tax bases, the Federal Treasury is directly underwriting the expansion of Toronto Stadium to a 45,736 capacity and retrofitting Vancouver's BC Place to hold 54,500 seats. Inside.effa.com importantly, this $750 million funding package is legally tied to long-term civic infrastructure. The capital is divided into two distinct components. $400 million is allocated for direct tournament logistics and immediate stadium operations, while the remaining $350 million is funneled into the Build Canada Homes program and local transit infrastructure surrounding the stadium zones. This is where Mark Carney's background as a central banker becomes glaringly obvious. The Canadian state is not treating the World Cup as a transient entertainment event. It is utilising the tournament as an institutional shield to absorb international capital, fast-track domestic infrastructure spending, and reinforce national sovereignty during a period of intense American protectionism. While Washington views the tournament as an internal security challenge to be managed via containment, Ottawa views it as a macroeconomic engine. The economic results are striking. While Deloitte Canada estimates the tournament will drive up to $3.8 billion Canadian dollars in positive economic output for the domestic market, the American tourism sector is actively bleeding billions due to its self-imposed border friction. By analysing the granular mechanics of these hosting frameworks, it becomes clear that Canada has executed a highly sophisticated regulatory arbitrage. By maintaining an open, legally secure visa architecture and backing it with $750 million in targeted federal capital, Canada has systematically positioned itself to capture the global cash flows fleeing American border hostility. The strategic realignment of North American trade is no longer just happening at formal negotiating tables in Washington. It is being executed live on the world stage, match by match, across the Canadian ledger. Yet, as the tournament progresses toward the knockout rounds, An even deeper structural vulnerability within the continental border system is beginning to surface. By engineering a comprehensive regulatory arbitrage through open-door visa protocols and heavy federal infrastructure spending, Canada has successfully positioned itself to capture the international capital and global prestige currently being rejected by the weaponized border policies of the United States. While Washington operates a highly defensive, containment-first security model that locks out entire nations, Ottawa is executing a sophisticated macroeconomic counter-strategy. When you step back from the immediate logistical chaos of the stadiums and the border checkpoints, the true dimensions of this continental schism become undeniable. This is not just a passing conflict over football fans and visa integrity fees. It is a fundamental reconfiguration of the power dynamics within the Canada-US relationship and a live demonstration of how Canada must navigate an increasingly transactional global order. The strategic implications of this divergence shatter the long-held myth of a seamless, integrated North American perimeter. For decades, the baseline assumption governing continental defence and trade was that Canada and the United States would operate in tandem, maintaining a harmonised approach to external threats and economic entry points. The pre-Trump era was defined by institutional alignment, where major joint initiatives, from the shared management of supply chains to harmonised visa waiver systems, were treated as routine matters of bilateral consensus. Today, that consensus is dead. By unilaterally enacting sweeping presidential proclamations that affect 1 in 5 countries on Earth, Washington has effectively informed Ottawa that American domestic political imperatives will always override continental partnership. Canada's decision to stand firm, implement its own regulatory framework, and keep its doors wide open is a declaration of sovereign divergence. It signals that Canada refuses to be a passive passenger in an isolationist American orbit. By providing an alternative, stable environment for global citizens and international entities, Ottawa is proving that it can operate an independent foreign policy right on the edge of the American superpower. This approach fundamentally alters the nature of Canada-US relations, shifting the dynamic from quiet compliance to active, calculated competition for global influence and economic capital. Suitors to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these structural shifts directly impact our long-term national trajectory, because this competitive dynamic extends far beyond the hospitality and tourism sectors. The ideological gulf exposed by the 2026 World Cup is a blueprint for how both nations will approach critical global alliances and strategic economic sectors for the next generation. Consider the broader global chessboard. While the United States retreats into a fortress mentality, alienating emerging markets across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America through punitive visa protocols, Canada is positioning itself as the indispensable bridge to the global majority. In the high-stakes arenas of international trade, critical minerals, and supply chain security, this reputational divide is highly consequential. As Canada aggressively seeks to diversify its economic partnerships away from a single, volatile dependency on the American market, the open posture maintained during this tournament serves as a massive proof of concept for global investors. It tells sovereign wealth funds, multinational conglomerates, and international talent pools that Canada remains a reliable, law-driven jurisdiction that is open to the world, even when our southern neighbour succumbs to severe protectionist impulses. While Washington uses its border as a blunt instrument of domestic nationalist theatre, Ottawa is treating its border as a precise tool of economic statecraft. The contrast with the pre-Trump era could not be sharper. And the financial and political fallout from this shift will outlast the final whistle of the tournament. The United States is discovering that a fortress strategy carries a massive structural penalty, one measured in billions of dollars of lost economic output, deteriorating human rights evaluations, and a profound erosion of soft power on the world stage. Conversely, Canada is demonstrating that a strategy of open, rule-based infrastructure investment can transform a transient sporting event into a permanent national asset. By directly linking the $750 million federal World Cup funding package to long-term civic transit and housing initiatives, The Canadian executive has successfully leveraged a global tournament to fortify the nation's domestic foundations. We are moving into an era where North American integration can no longer be taken for granted, and where Canada's ability to maintain its sovereign independence will depend entirely on its capacity to innovate around American constraints. The World Cup has stripped away the diplomatic pleasantries, revealing a continent operating under two completely incompatible visions of the future. One closed, securitized, and deeply defensive, the other open, strategic, and aggressively focused on global integration. The tournament runs until July 19th, and the economic data will continue to tally the immediate winners and losers of this regulatory battle. But as the teams advance and the global audience watches this asymmetric spectacle unfold, the true test of this sovereign divergence is fast approaching. The next